tardi. Conta bai. Mi che pratica mi papiamento, poco poco mi sta insegnando papiamento. It is such a great pleasure, and I've just arrived, and I have to say it feels like coming home, and I know it is home, and I'm really grateful for always the warm welcome here in Aruba. And the fact that I'm smiling like this, it's got nothing to do with the weather. It just is you, Minister-President, you, Minister. I know that you have had an amazing morning. I know that you've had some amazing speeches, and also your personal engagement for women in Aruba. I know it's close to your heart. So when you asked me to come, I didn't even have to think for 2 seconds. So thank you for having me here. And I have to say, I hope I'm not going to disappoint you. I'm not going to talk about women. I will talk about your theme being bold for change. But the reasons I won't be talking about women is because I love being one, but I have no idea why. Do you recognize that? 2 is I don't want to alienate the honorable gentleman in the room. And I know that you are much bigger experts on women's participation, political participation, and empowerment than I am. There's a lot of progress, but we know that there's a lot to go. We know that only 22.8% of all national parliamentarians in the world are women, and that is amazingly in 20 years only the double. In 95 it was only 11%, so we have a long way to go. And we know that there are only 10 heads of state who are women and 9 heads of government. So again, there's progress, but not enough. Interestingly, in Rwanda, a country that I happened to visit a number of years ago and was very, very impressed, it has the highest political participation of women in the world. So I won't talk about women, because you are the experts. What I will talk about is the inspiration that I drew from a quote from a Russian author, Maxim Gorky, and he kind of sums up what I'd like to share with you today. He says, only mothers can think of the future because they gave birth to it in their children. So I'm going to talk about mothers today. I want to talk about our future and society, and the role of children as change makers in society, and the role of mothers in that relationship to empower our children to be the positive change in society. And I'll talk to you about 3 parts in this complicated story, and I hope that you follow me. Just raise your hand if you lose me, if I lose you, rather, along the way. 1, I'd like to share with you my passion about the potential of children as society's positive change makers, which I know in Aruba is also very relevant, and that is a question around the world. 2, what it demands from mothers. Who is a mother here? Okay. And when I speak about mothers, I am absolutely aware that we cannot take motherhood for granted, and I know that there is a lot of women who would like to be mothers, who have difficulty being mothers. So I don't want to alienate them either. So the second one is what it demands from us as mothers to make sure that our children become the positive change makers. And then I'd like to imagine together what it is a world where 2 billion mothers are applying this thinking of being the empowerers of their children. 2 billion mothers around the world. So first, a bit about the role of children as positive change makers. You can look at this from a number of ways. You can, on the one hand, look at the numbers. Just the sheer numbers that 25% of the world's population are under 18 years old. So a very good reason to position children and young people as equal stakeholders in our societies. You can also look at this not just from the numbers, but also from a rights perspective. You know that the Convention of the Rights of the Child is the most ratified convention in the world. I think about 189 countries signed that convention. So it's a mere right of children and young people having a right to participate on issues that pertain to their future. And then I'd like to share my thoughts and my experiences around children and their potential when you look at the way they think, the way they look at society. They are open. They have clear opinions, but they don't have value judgments. They think from the perspective of desirability, not achievability. And we all know that if you look at the way, if you only set your goals from an achievability perspective, you only go halfway. If you look at the desirability, you might still get halfway, but desirability is twice the distance as the achievability. I'm not very good at math. I hope that you get that. But basically, I'm saying that if you look at issues from a desirability perspective, take, for example, the great work that the Minister-President has been doing on putting Aruba as the green economy, that's from a desirability point of view. And of course, it takes steps to achieve that, but you put that dot on the horizon further, and you will go further. And that's the mindset of children. They always look at solutions because they're not hindered by the systems and the conventions of our thinking that we as adults have been going for. So I believe we so need their thinking. We need this kind of thinking, not to put the responsibility on the shoulders, the small shoulders of children. We are still responsible as adults to fix the issues, because the state of the planet and the state of our societies is where we have gotten it to, but they can help us think as advisors. In many ways, I think the world is in transition. You look at issues like climate change and the ensuing energy transitions that we're going through, digital developments that are really changing the way that we consume and that we communicate, and many developments in society need that positively disruptive thinking. In Dutch, we have a word called omdenken. We have to think differently for different challenges that we're facing, and young children and young people can actually give that to us. Another reason is that young people, more than we think, they have much more knowledge than we think. I'm now 50 years old, going on 51, and when I look at young people now, when I was growing up, I was at 16 climbing trees in the salopette of my brother. And I was fortunate enough to have parents who brought the world to our dinner table. But now the world is brought to children through their phones. They have so much more knowledge than we think. We cannot underestimate them. And some may think, well, we have to keep them as children. I believe that too. But when the world comes to them, when they see the horrors of the world, when they see many difficult things happening, you want to empower them to do something with that. You look at recently around the world how political participation of young people is incredibly important. We had a vote in Europe, as you may know, where England decided to leave. You had 17 million young people who wanted to stay in Europe. What are we going to do with 17 million young people who want something different for their future compared to the older generations? Young people's participation, also in the political sphere, is the heart and the future of any democracy. And it is key that they do not lose confidence in our political system. If we do that, we are taking out the heart and the future of our societies. You may think, where on earth is she getting all this thinking? It's not Google, except for this wonderful quote of Mr. Gorky. It is that a number of years ago, I founded the Missing Chapter Foundation, and I am so, so proud that also in the Caribbean part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, starting in Aruba with all the incredible daadkracht that you have here in Aruba, that the Kids Council and the Missing Chapter Foundation is firmly established now here in Aruba, and that's one of the reasons I'm here, even though I make a slight stop. I leave again tomorrow to go to Curacao, but I come back a few days later to come back to Aruba to really take that to the next level. And so I live with one leg in, and what we do as Missing Chapter Foundation and the Kids Council is that we really empower young people to be the advisors to decision makers in the political sphere and in companies. And so I live with one leg in the world of children, and I live with the other leg in the world of adults. Now, if you look at my legs, they're the same. They're still very white, but they're the same. But I cannot tell you what it is to have the fortune to live with one leg, being constantly called to be an aligned person by the work that I do with children, and at the same time having to translate that into the world of the adults. And every day I learn, and I'm at the height of my senses thanks to these two worlds that I go. And I see the enormous benefits that it is when you go into dialogue with children. And every time when something bad happens in the world, and I'm facilitating a dialogue between decision makers and children and young people, I look at them and I am constantly reminded that we have a moral obligation to invest in them, and that we cannot give our cynicism or our negativism or our being lost in the world over to the next generation. I refuse to accept that. We have that moral obligation. So where does that leave us as mothers? And all the ladies, and yes, you men, you can also join, but I want to call onto the mothers. What does this mean for the role of change makers? What does it ask from mothers to do that? Of course, education is absolutely crucial. But when you think about it, that 2/3 of the time of children is spent at home. And still now, mothers are the ones often spending more time with their children, apart from the fact that we give birth to them, minor detail. So I'd like to call on a different type of mothering. It's not smothering that we need. It is not bothering that we need. I think we need e-mothering. And what do I mean by that? I'm also an author. I'd like to invent words. I think that e-mothering stands for empowerment by mothers. And all we need to do, in mind of this quote that we have from Mr. Gorky about the long-term thinking, we need to turn on our long-term button in our minds in line with the quote of the fact that we give birth to children, that only mothers can think of the future because they gave birth in it in their future, in their children. So we often talk about instilling empowerment in children for their own development, for their own talent. But let's not forget, in combination, it doesn't stop there. It's not just us from a mother to the child. If we see the child as the change maker in society, we actually have a deeper role than that. And through our children, we can influence society. And all we need to do is not be a smotherer or a botherer, but to be an e-mother. And yes, this is always, very often is this forgotten, because we generally live in a society, you probably recognize this, where we're more and more individualistic, where we talk, fortunately, more and more about the development of talents. But I believe in an African philosophy called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu, who knows this philosophy? Okay, a few hands. Ubuntu is something so simple and so beautiful, it's not difficult to remember. Ubuntu says, I am what I am because of who we are. That is a society. So in other words, if we only empower our children to know themselves, we continue the individualism that we perhaps do not want for our societies. So if we empower children to say, yes, develop your talents, recognize your talents, do the best that you can, but you also have a role in society, then, my goodness, these 2 billion mothers can really make a difference. So, what it requires in practice, it's a few things. And I am all the more happy to work through the Missing Chapter and through the partnerships that we have here in Aruba, to be here in Aruba. When I started here, a number of people said to me, don't even go there. I'll be honest. And I said, well, why not? It's because people said, well, you know, in Aruba, children are not so eloquent and they're not so standing up for themselves and knowing how to speak up. And I said, well, prove me wrong. I'll leave if it doesn't work. But I don't believe, because I believe every child has it. So in Aruba as well, the children... And experience has showed that I was right. Not to be sort of, I'm right, but it's true, and that's what happens. What experience shows that every child has in him or her the ability to be a critical and autonomous thinker. It is for us adults to give them the room to have that critical and autonomous thinking. That it is not either that kind of thinking or respect. They actually can go hand in hand. So if we allow our children to explore what that is, that critical thinking, to stimulate that, to be an example to them, to show an interest in society, by reading the newspaper, by bringing the world into the home, to discuss what they read, to not just say, stop going onto your iPhone, but actually say, what are you watching? And maybe they're watching something that is pertaining to the world. Have a discussion with them and talk to them. And discuss and say very subtly, not by putting the world onto their shoulders, as I said, but actually suggest and saying, you know what? You can aspire to be somebody in that society. So we can do so much as e-mothers to stimulate our children to realize that they are indeed a potential change maker in society. It has to do with stimulating their aspirations. Now that leaves me to the last part. I love dreaming. I love imagining. I cannot draw, and that's where, therefore, I write. But I always imagine things. I imagine a world where 2 billion mothers are empowered themselves to fulfill this role as e-mothers. And I realize, therefore, we have to, so in the end, the women's issue and the mother issue, of course they are one. Of course, we first need to feel empowered as individuals to be able to help others. But why not do it in the process and do it together with our children? I love imagining a world where 2 billion mothers stand up and remind the world of what kind of future they want for their children. And when some of the things are happening in the world, sometimes I feel like a revolutionary. And I want to stand up and say, if only mothers can stand up and say, stop, this is not the world that we want for our children. We want a different world. We want a world where people treat each other with respect. We want a world with peace and not war. We want dialogue and not debate. We want equality between men and women, no matter the background. If only we can turn on that long-term button and say that 2 billion mothers can stand up, would we not have a different world? And so I think that by imagining the future, we know what we need to decide today. It is actually taking the sustainability and sustainable development definition and flipping it. Because in our common future, a report written in 1987, where we talk about sustainable development, we say something very interesting. We say that the sustainable development is meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of future generations to have their dreams fulfilled. But it's very odd. If you say meeting the needs of today, you never get to the future. If you're flipping that definition and say we should be guided by what we need in the future to decide what we do today, then we always are having our long-term button switched on. And mothers, by nature, understand this more than anyone, because nature gave us the gift to produce the future. And again, I'd like to restate what I said at the beginning. Of course, I realize that we cannot take motherhood for granted, and that I am fortunate enough to have 3 children, and that there are many women who suffer emotionally, physically, because that they do not want the children that they have inside of them, or that they do want to have children and nature is not giving it to them. So let me be very clear that I'm not taking that for granted. But I believe in that power of those 2 billion mothers. So it starts in 3 ways. It starts with a consciousness about who we are and our own potential as individuals, as mothers, as women. It starts then with a consciousness of the role of our children as these potential change makers in society. It starts with our own interest in society, and that we realize we're not just individuals, but we're part of a bigger society, and a willingness to, and having the tools to empower children to be the catalyst for positive change. In conclusion, I strongly believe in women as societal influencers. I hope that is clear in my speech. One in their own right, and as the ones empowering their children to be the good people, to be active citizens and caring for the world. And I realize these are big words, but this is what children teach me. Just say it as it is. E-mothering for me means being an ally of your children and being the ally of other children and realizing that they're not just individuals, but they are citizens. And my wish is that all mothers are conscious of that role and have the tools and competencies to fulfill it. So in summary, I'd like to close with 2 more quotes that I did find on Google, I admit. And hopefully they sum up what I mean, and perhaps it will inspire you when you go back in your work, in your different roles, in the juggling roles that we all fulfill. One is by a US poet, Emerson, and he says, "Men are what their mothers made them." And finally, by the English novelist Forster, I'm sure that he felt as a revolutionary. He says, "I am sure that if the mothers of various nations could meet, there would be no more wars." So my final saying is, that's why I do believe very much in the theme of this conference, to be bold for change. The question is, who are you doing it for? Thank you very much.